Hello everyone. Endocrine hypertension is an important topic in endocrinology, and today I am going to present an overview of endocrine hypertension. I am Dr. Nishant Raisada. My qualifications and affiliations are on the screen. Hypertension broadly can be defined into essential hypertension and secondary hypertension, and majority of that is essential hypertension, almost 85%. And in secondary hypertension, the two main subdivisions are renal hypertension and endocrine hypertension. And today, of course, we're going to talk about endocrine hypertension. A broad classification of endocrine hypertension could be as follows. The adrenal dependent causes or syndromes. These include diseases such as leukocytoma, primary aldosteronism, Cushing syndrome, or CAH. You can have apparent mineralocorticoid excess, which is called AME, or 11-beta HSD deficiency, which can be genetic or acquired. You can have thyroid-dependent causes, parathyroid-dependent causes, and pituitary-dependent causes, such as acromegaly and Cushing syndrome. Now, first we look at the adrenal-dependent causes. Already this list you already know, and we will move on to pheochromocytoma. So pheochromocytoma, as you know, it's a catecholamine-secreting tumor, rises from the chromaffin cells of the adrenal medulla, and pheos means dusky, chroma means color, and therefore this is called pheochromocytoma as per the Greek words. And there is a dark staining reaction because of the oxidation of the catecholamines by dichromate salts. And these tumors can not only arise from the adrenals, but they can also arise from the sympathetic ganglia. And if that happens, they are referred to as extraadrenal pheochromocytoma or paragangliomas. This is an image which is showing encapsulated red-brown tumor. It has been cut open. So this slide shows the various enzymes involved in the synthesis of catecholamines. As you can see, it begins with tyrosine, and tyrosine hydroxylase enzyme. This is the rate-limiting step of the this entire synthetic process. Tyrosine will convert to dopa, then dopa will convert to dopamine, and dopamine will be converted to norepinephrine and finally epinephrine. Out of these, the last enzyme, that is the PNMT enzyme, requires cortisol, high levels of cortisol for its action. Therefore, this conversion occurs mainly in the adrenals. So, what we understand by this is that epinephrine producing leukocytomas or paragangliomas can arise only from the adrenals. So of course, paragangliomas cannot secrete epinephrine. That would be the correct interpretation, because high levels of cortisol will be only there in the adrenals. So the adrenal tumors can secrete more of epinephrine, whereas the extraadrenal tumors are likely to secrete more of norepinephrine. Now, catecholamine receptors, this is already known to most of us. You have the alpha receptors and beta receptors. The alpha 1 postsynaptic receptor is the one which causes vasoconstriction and increases the blood pressure, whereas the alpha 2 decreases the outflow, sympathetic outflow, and reduces the BP. As you know, alpha 2 agonists such as clonidine are used for control of hypertension. And the beta 1 receptors cause positive inotropic and chronotropic effects on the heart, whereas the beta 2 are the muscle relaxant. They have the bronchial vascularins to try and smooth muscle relaxation activity. And you also have the beta 3, and then you have the dopamine receptors, D1 and D2 receptors. Now this slide shows how catecholamines are broken down. So there are two enzymes. There is the monoamine oxidase, the MAO, and the catechol O-methyl transferase, or COMT. And both of these enzymes act in tandem, and accordingly which enzyme is acting first, you are going to get the different metabolites. But the important metabolites are metanephrine and normetanephrine, and eventually normetanephrine or metanephrine are converted into vanillyl mandelic acid, VMA. And this is important because the diagnosis of pheochromocytoma depends upon the detection of these metabolites apart from the catecholamines themselves. That is why we should be aware of these metabolites. The epidemiology of pheochromocytoma, it's not very common. It is supposed to be only represent less than 0.2% of people with hypertension. Annual incidence is 0.8 per 1 lakh person years. But many of the patients may have been missed, as the diagnosis may not be obvious. Male-female predisposition is almost equal, and they are likely to occur in the 4th or the 5th decade of life. And they're often sporadic, but they can be familial as well. especially if they occur at a younger age, or you have bilateral pheochromocytomas. And the typical syndromes that cause familial pheochromocytoma are autosomal dominant, and they may be diagnosed during surveillance of the affected family members or during genetic testing. So these are those genetic and syndromic forms that I was talking about. You have the men type 2, both A and B, which is the red gene, and then you have the neurofibromatosis type 1, and the von Hippel-Lindau disease, and the familial pheochromocytoma, all of which, as you can see, are autosomal dominant. So, what is the clinical presentation? 50% of the patients can be asymptomatic. They may be having no symptoms at all, and that is why a lot of patients can be missed. But the clinical effects that you see are due to the excess circulating catecholamines, and typically described symptoms are paroxysmal symptoms. But you can have a hypertension which is sustained also, and around 15% patients may remain normotensive despite having the tumor. So the classical triad of leukocytoma is headache, sweating, and tachycardia, but you may not see all the features in one single patient. So it's not mandatory to have the full triad. Apart from the hypertension, some patients will also have orthostatic hypotension, so which is paradoxical. They can have lightheadedness, presyncope, and syncope. And this lability is because of there is an episodic release of catecholamines, so there is episodic jump in BP and then the BP falls. Then you have a chronic volume depletion because of the hypertension, and there is also an altered sympathetic vascular regulation. That is because of the overstimulation of the sympathetic receptors. There can be an impaired response of these receptors to change in the posture, and which can lead to orthostasis. So the classical spell, which everyone has heard about, but it can be extremely variable. But for the same patient, it is stereotypical. The patient can always tell whether he is having a spell or not. Typically, they will have a forceful heartbeat, there will be pallor, tremor, and headache, and sweating. And the frequency can be variable. It can be several times a day, or it can be just once a month. But generally, it lasts for around 15 to 20 minutes. And they can be spontaneous, or they may occur after you have changed your posture or had some anxiety because of some reason. Some drugs can also precipitate, especially beta blockers, exercise, and change in intra-abdominal pressure because of a variety of conditions mentioned here can also precipitate a spell. Symptoms of the spell, apart from which I discussed, include nausea, vomiting, and dyspnea also, and epigastric chest pain can also occur. However, we have to understand spells can occur, spell-like symptoms can occur for in a variety of conditions, which could be endocrine, cardiovascular, or psychological. And so everybody who has got a spell may not be having a pheochromocytoma. So for example, you can see that in hypoglycemia. You can also see that in flushing that occurs in menopause. You can have that in cardiac diseases such as paroxysmal arrhythmias. You can have vasovagal syncopes. You can have hyperventilation, anxiety, and panic attacks, etc. Then again, pharmacological causes such as vancomycin, chloropropamide, and autonomic neuropathy. These are all, so there's a large list of conditions which can have a spell-like symptoms, which can mimic pheochromocytoma. So these are the chronic signs and symptoms: cold hands and feet. Patients may develop congestive heart failure because of cardiomyopathy, usually dilated cardiomyopathy. They may also be having a sense of fever or general increase in sweating. It may also present with painless hematuria. If you have a bladder paraganglioma, you can also have hypertensive retinopathy. So these are the other chronic signs and symptoms. So a lot of people remember a rule of 10 with respect to pheochromocytoma, and as you can see, it refers to the prevalence of various conditions such as excidental pheochromocytoma, occurrence in children, multiple lesions, or recurrence after surgical removal, malignancy, familial presentation, and incidental as a presentation. So this is, the rule of 10 says that each of these is 10%, but that is probably based on some very old data. Modern data does not support the rule of 10, and none of these figures is 10%. Each of the figures is maybe more or less than 10%. So when should you think about pheochromocytoma? Number one, of course, if you are having a history of a hepatologic spell, if you are having resistant hypertension, if you have a familial syndrome in which PO is known, if there is an incidentally discovered adrenal mass during an abdominal imaging, if you had a very rapid rise in blood pressure during surgery or during anesthesia, if you had having a patient hypertension at less than 20 years of age, you have a dilated cardiomyopathy for which you cannot pinpoint a cause, or you have the Carney's triad in which you have the gastrointestinal stromal tumors or pulmonary chondromas. So these conditions you should suspect pheochromocytoma and go ahead for investigation the same. Now, one important principle of endocrinology is that you always make your biochemical diagnosis first, and once you've made the biochemical diagnosis, only then you go to localization. And this is applicable to all aspects of endocrinology, not just to pheochromocytoma. Therefore, if you think patient has pheochromocytoma, the first step is not to order an MRI or a CT of the abdomen. The first step is to get the biochemistry in order. First step is to prove biochemically that this pheochromocytoma is there, and only then you move to localization. But before ordering the biochemical test, you have to look at some important points. Most important of those being you have to know what are the medicines that can interfere with the assay, and those medications, some of them are antihypertensives and they will have to be discontinued. Other antihypertensives can be continued. Most commonly interfering drugs are the tricyclic antidepressants, which are being used not only for depression but for also a variety of other conditions. And you have to discontinue the drugs for at least 2 weeks. If there is some ongoing physical stress or illness, that can cause a false increase in the catecholamine levels, and that should not be a time to do the test for pheochromocytoma. So this is a full list of the medications which can interfere. As I said, most common are tricyclic antidepressants. Levodopa, of course, as you know, dopa is one of the catecholamines itself. So that's not the right time to do when somebody is on levodopa. Uh, Reserpine, etc., no longer very commonly used. Withdrawal from clonidine can also lead to this, and even alcohol can cause an increase in catecholamines. So these are the medications which can interfere. So what is the test that you must do? The ideal test to diagnose leukocytoma is measurement of fractionated metanephrines and catecholamines in a 24-hour urine sample. And these includes measurement of norepinephrine, epinephrine, dopamine, metanephrine, and normetanephrine. Ideally, the method by which it should be measured should be an HPLC with electrochemical detection or the liquid chromatography mass spectrometry. The LCMS is of course not that frequently available in commercial laboratories, and by HPLC is pretty good. But ELISA can be a little tricky, and a lot of laboratories are actually doing an ELISA for catecholamines, which may not be very sensitive. You may want to measure the urinary creatinine to verify that adequate 24-hour collection has been done, because that is a problem. A lot of patients do not collect the full urine, and then you may get a falsely low value. Uh, there is also a plasma fractionated metanephrine which is available, but it is not recommended as a screening test because it has a very high false positive rates. So if you already have a tumor and you have the typical symptoms, you may just want to finish it off by doing a plasma fractionated metanephrine levels, but you can get a positive plasma fractionated metanephrine in normal people also, and you should not start investigating them on the basis of this biochemical test. So there are some cutoffs for the positive case detection. Even if the normetanephrine is above the normal, that does not mean that it is suggestive of pheochromocytoma. But a level of normetanephrine more than 900 micrograms in 24 hours and metanephrine more than 400 micrograms in 24 hours is considered to be positive for pheochromocytoma. And accordingly, the cutoff for norepinephrine, epinephrine, and dopamine is also given in this slide. So the elevation must be beyond these values to be considered a positive test. So once you've got a positive test, then you can move on to localization studies. Typically, you would do a CT or MRI of the adrenal glands and abdomen, and around 85% of the tumors are in the adrenal glands, and 95% are in the abdomen and pelvis. That means the 10% of the tumors will be there in the pelvis and abdomen, but not in the adrenal itself. And most of these are paragangliomas, typically located in the paraortic area, superior abdominal or inferior abdominal. They can be in the urinary bladder, but they can also be there in the mediastinum and head and neck areas. And those are the other 5% of the tumors. So what will you find when you do an imaging? These are round to oval tumors and have a smooth margin. Generally, they are more than 3 centimeter in size. They are not homogeneous, and they have areas of cystic degeneration or hemorrhage within them. They show marked contrast enhancement, and on CT scan, the attenuation without contrast is more than 10 Hounsfield unit, and they have a delayed contrast washout. That is, less than 50% of the contrast will be washed out in 10 minutes. If you do an MRI, you will get typically a high signal intensity T2 weighted image, and that is also referred to as a light bulb sign, which we'll be seeing in the subsequent slide. And this is this is a CT scan of the abdomen, and you are seeing the large tumor here it is the tumor here, and this is the tumor out here. So this is the light bulb sign which I was talking about on the MRI abdomen. So this bright echo coming from the tumor in the T2 weighted image. There is also an MIBG scan, which is generally used only when you cannot localize the tumor. It is performed with either iodine 123 or 131 meta-iodobenzyl guanidine. It is indicated, as I said, when CT-MRI are negative. MIBG is taken up and preferentially by the catecholin producing tumors, and therefore it is useful to pick up extradental pheochromocytoma. And also, if you suspect that your pheochromocytoma is malignant and having metastasis, then it will help you in picking these as well. But it is important to know that drugs such as amlodipine, labetalol, which are commonly used antihypertensives, as well as TCAs, haloperidols, they can all interfere with MIBG, and they have to be stopped before you can go ahead and do MIBG. Otherwise, you can get a falsely negative MIBG scan. This is an MIBG image, and you can see in the left adrenal area there is a concentration of the tracer, and this helps you to pick up the lesion. Genetic testing is required in patients who have paraganglioma. Paragangliomas are less likely to be sporadic, so all paragangliomas warrant genetic testing. Bilateral adrenal pheochromocytomas are again not sporadic, they need genetic testing. If you have a family history of few, then again genetic testing is important. Onset at a young age, and if you have clinical symptoms of suggestive of a syndromic disorder, these are the conditions which should prompt you to ask for a genetic testing. Now we come to the treatment part. The final treatment, of course, is surgical excision, but it's a two-step process. Step one is medical preparation for surgery, and after that, you move on to your adenectomy. If you go ahead for surgery without medical preparation, which sometimes happens, you can land up with lethal hypertensive crisis. You can have malignant arrhythmias and multi-organ failure, and which result in a high surgical mortality. So how do you do medical preparation for surgery? You first begin with your alpha-adrenergic blockade. You block the alpha receptors. Subsequently, after this blockade has been done, you try to expand the intracellular volume by giving a high sodium diet and a lot of fluids. You monitor the blood pressure, and subsequently, once you control the blood pressure and there is tachycardia, then you add your beta-adrenergic blockade to control the pulse rate as well. So the alpha-adrenergic blockade is started 7 to 10 days preoperatively. The target is to normalize the blood pressure and expand the contracted blood volume. The most commonly recommended drug is phenoxybenzamine. In our part of the world, phenoxybenzamine is not that frequently available. It's expensive, and we generally use prazosin in place of phenoxybenzamine. So phenoxybenzamine it's a blocker which is a sort of a non-reversible kind of profile. So this probably gives a more sustained blockade. But with prazosin, probably it is not a reversible. It is a reversible blockade, and therefore prazosin has to be given 4 times a day generally. And we prefer to use the shorter acting variant rather than the XL variant of prazosin. BP monitoring should be done at least 6 to 8 hourly. Pulse should be measured as well as BP. You would like to check your BP both seated as well as standing. Target BP is less than 130 by 80 in seated position and more than 90 in standing position. And the pulse rate for the seated position is 60 to 70 and should be 70 to 80 on standing. And always the pulse target cannot be met with alpha blockade alone, and then later on we have to add the beta blocker. Regarding the high sodium diet, it should be started on the second or third day of the alpha blockade. There should be at least more than 5 grams of sodium in the diet per day, and this helps in expanding the blood volume. And this expansion can be monitored by looking at the hematocrit, and that will give you an idea whether the volume has expanded or not. You should encourage oral fluid intake and watch for CHF for renal failure if the disease is there. Beta-adrenergic blockade is to be done only after alpha-adrenergic blockade, as you know, because there is a risk of unopposed alpha-adrenergic stimulation with increased BP if you give the beta blocker first. You start off with a low dose and then gradually increase till you achieve the beta pulse targets. If the BP control is not achieved alone by the alpha blockade, you can consider adding calcium channel blockers. In malignant disease, even the tyrosine hydroxylase inhibitor called metarosine is also being used. There is a historical criteria called Roizen criteria, which is popular with anesthesiologists, not so much with us. But anyway, these are the points. BP, no in hospital BP should be more than 160 by 90 in the 24-hour prior to surgery. There should be no orthostatic hypotension, and blood pressure should not be less than 80 by 45. There should be no STD changes for a week prior to surgery, which is important, which we also look at. And there should be no more than 5 ventricular premature complex beats per minute. An acute hypertensive crisis can occur before or during the surgery and should be treated with intravenous medication, typically with the sodium nitroprusside, nicardipine, or phentolamine. And for cardiac arrhythmias, lidocaine or esmolol can be employed. Surgery is definitely the definitive management. Laparoscopic surgery is the procedure of choice, but cannot be done if the size is more than 8 centimeters. It ensures minimum tumor handling and avoids capsule rupture. And the entire adrenal should be removed in sporadic cases. And intraoperatively, blood pressure and arrhythmias have to be monitored very carefully. Post-operatively, patient can develop hypotension. In fact, patient do develop hypotension immediately after the tumor has been resected, and it has to be managed by IV fluids, and sometimes even vasopressors have been given. Repeat biochemical testing to ensure a cure is done at least 1 to 2 weeks after that to make sure whatever circulating catecholamines are there have been fully metabolized. Hypertension may persist for longer in some cases despite a biochemical cure. This is probably because of some vascular activity. And a recurrence is possible, especially if the patient has a familial disease in which they are predisposed to such tumors. So that is the end of this presentation. And in the second presentation, we will take up primary aldosteronism. Thank you for listening. Hope you find this useful, and I will see you in the next one.